What's going on, gamers? Shaw here, and today in this video we're going to take a quick look at what cooldowns a tank should be tracking in Mythic Plus. There are a ton of different classes that you might run into while running. Anything from the warrior to the mage to the warlock. There are a ton of different cooldowns that a tank should be familiar with to try to utilize to maximize their group's damage. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Omni CD and quickly going through some of the cooldowns that I think is worthwhile tracking. Let's dive in. I'm not going to be spending a whole lot of time in this video talking about how to set up Omni CD, but I have already done that in another video. I'm going to have it linked down in the description below, as well in the right hand corner of the screen. There should be a pop-up at any moment, probably, if I'm not too stupid. But Omni CD is a really cool cooldown tracking add-on that you can actually get from CurseForge. But I figured this would be the best way to talk about which classes cooldowns you want to be tracking. So some classes have covenant abilities that are more rotational based, and some classes have covenant abilities that are more cooldown based. These covenant abilities in pair with the class cooldowns can really pack a punch, and if pulled around correctly can make a dungeon run extremely smooth. There are a ton of different DPS specs in the game, so today we're going to quickly go through all of these. So we're going to start with Death Knight. There are two covenant abilities that I would recommend tracking when playing with Death Knights, and that would be the Abomination Limb and Swarming Mists of both the Necrolord and Venthyr Covenant. Some DKs will play Death Stew, but because this is actually this ends up being their Death and Decay, it's more rotational based. When it comes to Unholy DK, I recommend tracking Apocalypse and Army of the Dead. These two major cooldowns are really powerful, especially in single target situations. Breath of Sindragosa, Pillar of Frost, and Frostworm's Fury are the three CDs I would track on a Frost Death Knight. Now, Pillar of Frost, you can argue you don't have to track since it's a fairly short cooldown, and typically DKs will hit it on cooldown, but it's still nice to know that they have something active to do some decent damage. Now, there are other cooldowns like Empower Rune Weapon, but this is a CD you typically would pair with Breath of Sindragosa or Pillar of Frost, so I think tracking all of those cooldowns would be a little overwhelming. Alright, moving on to Demon Hunter, we have Sinful Brand and the Hunt. These are the two most common covenants that people play. While Sinful Brand is a little more of a rotational ability, I like to track it to make sure that I know that my Demon Hunter has damage for a single target mob. When you take a look at their actual cooldowns, all you're really going to be looking for is Metamorphosis. This CD, when it's available, can allow a Venthyr DH to do so much damage in an AoE situation. So essentially what's going on right now is that they apply Sinful Brand to a target, and their I-Beam constantly extends the dot, and the dot does a ton of damage. But with Metamorphosis, it applies to everything within 8 yards Sinful Brand, and I-Beam extends that duration indefinitely. So, Metamorphosis is a great CD to track. Druid, you have Convoke the Spirits and Ravenous Frenzy. Typically, Ravenous Frenzy will be paired with Incarn, so it's not something you necessarily need to track, and Convoke the Spirits is a very powerful 1-minute CD. I also track Lone Empowerment. This is typically known as something else when a player is botted with someone, but it does increase their damage done by 15% for 10 seconds if they're empowered with themselves. Looking at their cooldowns, we can see that we should be tracking Berserk, as well as Celestial Alignment and Incarnation. Berserk is going to be used typically by Feral Druids, and Celestial Alignment or Incarnation will be used by Boomkins. Next we have Hunters. This one's pretty easy. Resonating Arrow or Wild Spirits. Flayed Shot and Death Chakram are typically used on cooldown, and it's more rotational, so that's why I don't track them. But Res Arrow and Wild Spirits can definitely do a lot of damage in AoE and single target scenarios. Then you have Aspect of the Wild for Beastmaster Hunters, you have Coordinated Assault for Survival Hunters, and you have True Shot for your Marksmanship Hunters. There are a ton of cooldowns as you can see here. I don't think most of them are worth tracking or worth even looking at, because most of them are either rotational or they're talents that sometimes hunters typically don't take. Next we have our Magus, our Mage. Deathborn is really the only one that I typically track, but you can also track Radiant Spark if you're interested. Radiant Spark is what you're going to see Arcane Mages play, and Deathborn is going to be your Frost Mage. Fire Mages typically run Shifting Power, but it's not a CD I feel like you really need to track because they should be hitting it on cooldown. When it comes to each individual spec though, you're going to want to be looking out for their Combustion for the Fire Mage, the Arcane Power for the Arcane Mage, and of course the Frozen Orb and Icy Veins combination from the Frost Mage. Most Frost Mages do a pretty good job of keeping Icy Veins active, and they can extend the duration as well as reset the cooldown before it actually expires if the tank's pulling big enough. The only reason I track this is to know that the Frost Mage has Icy Veins active and if I should continuously pull so they can constantly have Icy Veins up. Next we have the Monk. Bone Dust Brew is typically the choice for the Windwalker, but Weapons of Order can also be played sometimes. We then also have their Zuen, as well as their Storm Earthfire CD. Typically Storm Earthfire is going to be used in pair with Zuen, but Storm Earthfire can also be used with Bone Dust Brew. So it's up to you if you'd like to track Storm Earthfire. I typically don't bother, but again, not a bad thing to track. For Paladin, it's really simple. Divine Toll is the main thing you want to be tracking here, as well as the Avenging Wrath for that huge damage. Sometimes Paladins will run Final Reckoning, but in the current meta, they aren't. This gives them a very strong 1-minute burst CD, though, almost every pull, so tracking it isn't always the worst thing in the world, so if they happen to be running it, at least you know it's there. No one plays Priests. Rogues are very centered. I'm kidding, we'll go back to Priest. So Boon of the Ascended can be played often by your healing priest, but I have seen some Shadow Priests go Fey Guardians, Unholy Nova, or Boon. Unholy Nova, though, is going to be more of the common choice. This is a very strong CD on a 1-minute cooldown. And then for their actual cooldowns in their toolkit, you have Void Eruption as well as Mindbender. These two cooldowns will do pretty good damage every minute and a half, as well as Power Infusion on the 2-minute CD. Rogue Covenant abilities are actually almost all rotational based, so you don't really have to worry about tracking them. And then for their cooldowns, similar to maybe like Shaman or something like that, their CDs don't do as much damage as something like a Fire Mage. So their cooldowns aren't as important to track, but it's always good to know if they have them up. Things like Shadow Blades, Vendetta are really good for the Sub Rogue and the Assassination Rogue. And then of course you have your Outlaw Rogue, which is really strong right now, wielding that Adrenaline Rush and Killing Spree. Shamans are typically going to be running either Chain Harvest or Fate Transfusion, but you might see the occasional Primordial Wave. The reason I don't track this though is because it's a rotational ability on a 45-second CD. Anything really under a minute isn't that important to track unless it's going to make up a large portion of a character's damage. Primordial Wave doesn't really do that. When it comes to their actual cooldowns, Ascendance is good to track just in case they're actually running it, your Feral Spirits for the Enhancement Shaman, and then your Elementals, both Storm and Fire, as well as Stormkeeper for the Ellie Shaman. For Warlock, Impending Catastrophe in the Venthyr Covenant, as well as Soul Rot in the Night Fae Covenant are both really good to track. This typically means that they have some type of damage available. And then when it comes to their major cooldowns, the Affliction Locks that I have played with in the past said that Dark Glare actually isn't as important as Dark Soul. And then of course for Infernal and Tyrant for the Demo Lock and the Destro Lock respectively, these are the CDs you'd like to be tracking. Dark Soul is a little bit more of a powerful cooldown than Dark Glare, but Dark Glare, if you'd like to track, you can. It's just not as impactful as Dark Soul. Dark Glare, from my understanding at least, is more for single target and doesn't really scale that well into AoE, unlike Dark Soul, which allows them to get off more Seeds of Corruption, which ultimately results in more damage. Last but not least, we do have the Warrior, Ancient Aftershock, Spirit Bastion, and Conqueror's Banner. Very rarely do you see any Necrolord DPS warriors, but, you know, there are some players out there. Ancient Aftershock and Spirit Bastion, though, with the Night Fae Covenant and the Kyrian Covenant, respectively, do a ton of damage on a 1 minute and a 1.5 minute CD. Inside of this, or on top of this, you also have Avatar and Bladestorm and Recklessness. Recklessness being the Fury Warrior, and Avatar being the Arms Warrior. I know some people who do track Warbreaker to understand when a Arms Warrior might be doing some good AoE burst damage, but I don't think it's worth tracking because it is, again, rotational. But that pretty much covers it. There are a ton of specs here, and there's a lot of stuff that you can track. I don't ever really recommend tracking any more than maybe 8 to 9 abilities per class. It just makes your bars look really hectic. As you can see here with my Druid, if I was in a group with myself, you would see that I would be tracking 7 abilities. Now personally, let's just say we can come back to Druid and I can uncheck Ravenous Frenzy because I know that Ravenous Frenzy will often be paired with Incarn. Now there's some other things that I'm tracking like defensives and trinkets, but that is totally subjective to the player. I hope that this video helps, and I hope it helps with provide a little bit of guidance on what a tank should track. If I miss anything, let me know. I don't play with all these classes often enough to understand the full in-depth analysis of what I should be tracking for each DPS, but for the most part, these are the major CDs you want to be looking out for when you're pugging. Alright, hope you guys learned something, hope you're staying happy, healthy, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.